So I'm Paul, I'm on the team, and I'd like to throw some FUD at you today. Friendly, upbeat discussion. A different kind of FUD in this industry. So I'm actually here to talk about myths in the DLT space. And I found this dictionary definition, two very different interpretations of what a myth is. So number two is the one that I'll primarily focus on, and we'll talk about what I see as widely held but ultimately false ideas, both about DLTs in general and, not surprisingly, Hashgraph. But the first interpretation of what a myth is sort of an origin story, a Norse saga or something comparable. So to set the context, excuse me, I thought I'd talk about my origin story of how I came to Hashgraph. So actually, back, please. I jumped ahead. So you met Mance, you met Patrick. I used to work with Mance and Patrick at an identity management company called Ping ID. Mance and I worked for Patrick, now at Swirls, trying to keep this straight. Patrick and I work for Mance. So I think in the next venture, I'm the boss, and things are going to change. So yeah, Mance and I worked for Patrick in the CTO office at Ping Identity. And about 3 years ago, Mance started coming to our group. We had a team of about 6 or 7. And every time we had a quarterly meeting, Mance would come in and try to get us fired up about this new thing that his friend Lehman had invented. It wasn't called Hashgraph at the time. We actually helped Mance come up with that name as a team. So every 3 months, we'd have a meeting, and Mance would talk about gossip, and we'd do email while he tried to get us interested in this idea. And most of the people in that room didn't know what blockchain was, much less the difference between a blockchain and a DAG. Nevertheless, when Mance left to join or to create Swirls with Lehman, we stayed in touch, and as often the case, friends and the bonds of friendship broke those of corporate affiliation, and I joined. So I joined about a year ago, and I knew nothing about blockchain. I knew nothing about DLTs, and the small bit I did know about, I was skeptical of. A year later, I know a little bit more, and I'm slightly less skeptical. So the learning curve of the last year ultimately is what I'm going to talk about today. Because the myths that I present today are things that I believed once, right? Because they're intuitive or they're easy or easy enough to comprehend. And the myths that I present ultimately are sort of the realization that they may not be true are light bulb moments I've had over the past year. Most of them initiated by Lehman telling me that they're not true, and this is why they're not true. So I've benefited from his insight. So with that, let's get into it. And the first one is the biggie, right? This caused me no end of confusion when I got into the space, because too often distributed ledger technologies, DLTs, are described as somehow creating either trust or truth, or perversely being trustless. So there's initial set of confusion. So to dig into that, I would first suggest that it doesn't make sense to talk about trust unless you qualify it with who you're trusting and what you're trusting them to do or not to do. So trust should always be about trusting X to do Y. And before DLTs, you had to trust X, X being some central party, some middleman, some mediator, to do a lot of Ys, or to not do a lot of Ys. You had to make a big trust leak. DLTs ultimately changed that, because they both change who you have to trust and what you expect them to do or not to do. So they change the X and the Ys. In Hashgraph's particular case, but generally is true as well, you have to trust the network to mostly follow the rules. Specifically, you have to trust that more than 66% will follow the rules, because otherwise the theorem predicts that consensus can be stopped or corrupted. So that's a rather vague statement. You have to trust people to follow the rules. It's made concrete by the crypto and the algorithm. So in Hashgraph's case, the belief that 66% will follow the rules is ultimately converted into trust in the fact that a double spend won't happen. Next, Hashgraph is a directed acyclic graph, a DAG. We're not the only DAG in the space. We're not the first. And the fact that when you look at our data structure diagrams, which you've seen countless times over the last 2 days in various permutations, they look the same as the diagrams of the other DAGs in the space, IOTA as a notable example. So I think there's an easy temptation to think that all DAGs are the same because of this intuitive similarity. 2 things I will suggest. More important than whether or not a ledger is a DAG or not is what the DAG captures. The DAG, the data structure, nodes, or vertices and edges, ultimately captures some representation of the world. Something is, the semantics are meaningful. Hashgraph's DAG captures an actual history of messages. And through gossip about gossip, the DAG allows everybody to recreate this shared, consistent history of messages. And from that, we can extract consensus. Other DAGs capture very different information. Not a history of messages, but something more like a confirmation or an affirmation that something is good. So not surprisingly, the consensus you can extract from that DAG is very different. The corollary is that DAGs aren't particularly exciting. It's just a data structure, right? Hashgraph throws away the DAG as we process it. So for us, it's this intermediate data structure that we analyze to get the more fundamental consensus state. Here's a good one. So proof of work is tolerant of malicious nodes, right? Tolerant up to a certain level of number of malicious nodes. And sometimes malicious actors, nodes, is equated with Byzantine because of the Byzantine generals problem and that analogy. And so sometimes people make the leap of faith and say that, well, proof of work then is tolerant of Byzantine faults, and therefore it's Byzantine fault tolerant. But that's not the case. BFT has a very precise definition, and we've heard it multiple times over the last few days, that consensus has finality. There is a definite moment in time when you reach consensus and you know that others excuse me, will reach it as well. That's a very different sort of consensus than a sort of growing confidence over time through multiple blocks. So I cringed when Ken Anderson was talking 2 or 3 presenters ago, because Ken made the statement that large networks are more secure. And I knew I had this myth that contradicted him. So I can reconcile the differences by large networks are more secure, are more decentralized, all else being equal. All else being equal with respect to the dynamics between the members of the community. But all else is never equal. Large communities, large numbers of nodes is more decentralized, is more resistant or tolerant to collusion, coercion, censorship, et cetera, but only if those nodes are also distributed across different axes. For instance, if they're all in one country, then having 1,000 nodes, if 990 are in one locale, can destroy the benefits of the large N in the first place. Here's a good one. I've read somebody asserting, inevitably from a project that doesn't have particularly high throughput, that you don't need particularly high throughput. Visa peaks at 50,000 transactions per second, presumably around American Thanksgiving or Christmas. And so anything above that would be overkill, because clearly Visa works as is. That's our target. Of course, that ignores the fact that Visa is one application, and we have to build a platform that can support 1,000 simultaneous dApps running at the same time. The corollary to this is some projects argue that we don't even need throughput, that the dApps are not yet ready for throughput, so platforms such as Hashgraph and our competitors shouldn't be focused on it, and that those who do are, in a sense, participating in some sort of pointless beauty contest around throughput. And of course, that seems to ignore the reality of the dApps in the room that need the throughput and argue that it's relevant. So a number of times we've touched today or hinted at controlled mutability in Hashgraph. Controlled mutability in Hedera, to be precise, is a recognition that hard immutability, both of the history of transactions and the state that results from them, creates a lot of significant issues. We've heard issues around GDPR and the right to be forgotten that set of regulations defines. But hard immutability also creates significant issues just for blockchain bloat. If you can't throw away a part of your transaction history, then you're stuck with it forever. And that has implications both for how many nodes you can have in the network because of the associated storage burden, and that has implications for decentralization and security. So I was so looking forward to using this line and asserting that the myth is there is such a thing as a free lunch, but Lehman stole the line. Then Patrick stole the line. They both made the point that the Hedera model is that fees should be transparent and clear and predictable, and that trying to hide the actual costs and the appropriate compensation to the nodes is ultimately a mistake. Better is a fee model that allows dApps to easily calculate and predict the corresponding prices for a given transaction, and critically, appropriately compensate the nodes for creating consensus for that transaction. So Bitcoin, of course, does have a 51% attack, and it also has other attacks. And as predicted by the Byzantine General's paper, every DLT, Bitcoin included, Hashgraph included, has a 33% attack. Lehman has a very intuitive explanation of how this attack would work for Bitcoin. Premise is that not only does the attacker control 34% of the nodes, but they also control a firewall. And by judicious use of the firewall, they can split the honest 66% of the nodes into two halves and logically tackle them one by one. So if you believe that it's feasible that a malicious actor might also have control of a firewall and would use it to their own benefit, I think there are existing precedents in the world and the internet today. Proof of stake POS systems are seen as the next evolution away from proof of work and the arguably wasteful use of electricity that proof of work implies. And I sometimes see a tendency to equate all proof-of-stake systems together because they're seen as different than proof-of-work, therefore they must be similar. They all share the same basic premise that the scarce resource by which we mitigate Sybil attacks and other attacks is the number of tokens given actors have, whether they're nodes or non-nodes who are nevertheless allowed to contribute their tokens. But there's lots of variations within that large space. Delegated proof-of-stake is one important variation where those who will not actually run a node are nevertheless allowed to use their stake to elect nodes, who will then be given the privilege of creating blocks. Our proxy staking model in Hedera feels similar to that, in that it's motivated by the same goal of allowing non-nodes to nevertheless use their stake towards consensus for the security benefits it gives us. But critically, in proxy staking, the stake that is proxied by me to a node directly influences consensus. I'm not using it to elect a node and empower them to be a block producer or a consensus node. I'm logically lending them my stake and saying, use this, and you'll pay me for the privilege. And critically, in Hedera, the stake I, or the stake I as a node make, or that which I proxy to a node, I don't bond it. There's no loss of liquidity. I can spend it at any time. Nor, as Lehman pointed out, is there any slashing. There's no risk of me losing it. Our model is, rather than disincentivizing bad behavior through slashing, we just make it impossible, right? Modulo 33%. And this is the last one. And the myth, quote unquote, is that we should expect all IoT devices to be able to directly contribute towards consensus, i.e., act as a consensus node. Some IoT devices will be able to bear that burden, but there are real costs towards participating in consensus, even for an efficient algorithm like Hashgraph with no proof of work, intentionally blowing up the processing burden. There are still implications for minimum bandwidth, processing, and storage. And many IoT devices will just not be able to meet those criteria. And so notwithstanding the sort of intuitive attractiveness of millions and billions of nodes acting as consensus nodes, or million devices, we think it's more realistic that a constrained IoT device will act as a client to an actual node, more appropriately performant. And that fits in with a lot of IoT architectures with the distinction between devices and gateways and proxies. So I think it's nicely compatible. And with that, I thank you very much. If you're further along on your educational curve towards DLTs and none of these were new to you, congratulations, because I'm still working my way through them. Thank you.